Good morning, everyone. My name is Lauren Abner. I'm the technology consultant here at KDLA. Some of you may know me from working with the E-rate program, which provides discounts on internet access and networking equipment. But today we also have a number of attendees who are part of the Public Library Institute. And I thought this session might be interesting because even if someone else in your library handles E-rate filing, you still have to be concerned about CIPA and understand what it is, because that impacts the experience that your library patrons have when using the internet in your building. Okay, so we've got a few objectives, at least what I hope we can achieve by the end of this. That you'll be able to describe the basic requirements of the Children's Internet Protection Act, and you'll be able to identify some of the issues that come up as you're filtering your internet for compliance. And then you'll have a better understanding and more confidence in handling patron requests when it comes to unblocking web pages, lifting the filter. You'll understand why it needs to be done, and hopefully talk to folks at your library about how to do that if you're not already aware. So per usual with webinars, I always have a disclaimer that says, basically I'm not the final authority on any particular program. But for this one, since we will be discussing a lot of legal concepts, I just want to point out that I am the furthest thing possible from a lawyer. So if you need legal advice, if your library needs legal advice, you should discuss those issues with the library's attorney. All right, just a moment. Just want to change a quick setting. Okay, now we'll get into the main content. Now, a little precursor before we really get into what CIPA is to make sure we're not confusing it with some other very similar programs that either have a similar intent but didn't go into effect, or something that has a similar name that could be confusing. So basically, since Congress started providing funding to libraries and schools for internet service, they've been concerned that those federal tax dollars would somehow go toward making obscene materials, making pornography available for kids. Like, we don't want our federal funds supporting that. So back in 1996, the Telecommunications Act created the E-rate program for schools and libraries to get discounts. And as part of that, a section was the Communications Decency Act, which tied that federal funding for the E-rate program to the requirement for filtering. But that was immediately challenged. It was overly broad, and it was a year later declared unconstitutional. But then Congress made some more attempts. In 1998, we had the Child Online Protection Act with very similar intent as the Communications Decency Act. And it took until 2009 for that to be fully declared unconstitutional because of 3 different lawsuits. So it never went into effect. And then also in 2000, we have the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act. And that is in effect, but it's different than the various laws relating to CIPA. So for that, apologies while I mute a couple folks. Okay. So with that particular law, it does not impact libraries in the sense that libraries are not required to adhere to certain regulations about collecting personal information from users who are under the age of 13. Now, you've all seen when you're on various websites that you get the pop-up that asks if you're 13 or older, or you have to enter your birth date, and that's why that comes up. But this law, that particular law, does not relate to filtering, and again, it does not impact libraries because you're government entities, and which means the law does not apply to you. It's only for commercial websites. And then, of course, we have the Children's Internet Protection Act, or CIPA, which is our subject of discussion today, that was also passed in 2000 And unlike the Communications Decency Act and the Child Online Protection Act, CIPA actually was declared constitutional after a lawsuit that the ALA filed that went all the way to the Supreme Court. Okay, so now we know that we're not going to be confused about those other similarly named programs. Let's talk about what the Children's Internet Protection Act is. This is a law, again, enacted in 2000 that addresses concerns about accessing offensive content, such as obscenity, on internet, at schools, and on library computers. Now, at the same time, this is just a note that we have to say before we move along. Technically, there are two separate laws. There's the Children's Internet Protection Act, which requires filtering and some kind of internet safety policy. Then a separate act passed at the same time called the Neighborhood Children's Internet Protection Act more specifies what has to be included in that internet safety policy. So the requirements for NCIPA only apply to E-rate and the Emergency Connectivity Fund. But if you're going to be CIPA compliant, you might as well be NCIPA compliant as well. It's a one little extra step to include certain elements in your policy. So for the rest of the presentation, when I say CIPA compliance, know that I am referring to both CIPA and NCIPA. And also, while CIPA also applies to schools with certain federal programs, the requirements are just a little bit different. They have some additional things to do in regards to safety of students using internet at school. So this is just particularly about library compliance. So why should we care about CIPA? So one of the big answers is that CIPA is tied to a lot of funding for libraries. Now, that's certainly not the only reason we should care about CIPA, but the funding is pretty important. Since 1998, the first year that libraries could apply for E-rate, Kentucky Public Libraries have received over $22 million in disbursements. The Emergency Connectivity Fund, which was created this year to address the pandemic, Kentucky libraries have requested over $1 million in support and thus far have received commitments of $900,000. So those are the particular FCC programs where you need to worry about CIPA. And then there are several programs or funding sources that funnel through the Institute of Museum and Library Services, or IMLS. That's where KDLA's federal funding comes from. So we are supported by the Library Services and Technology Act. Our agency receives a certain allotment each year based on population. And sometimes we are providing subgrants of our funding directly to libraries, which would force you to be CIPA compliant depending on what you're purchasing. And then more recently, due to the pandemic, other sources of funding have also gone through IMLS, and then KDLA has distributed to libraries. So last year we had the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, or CARES Act. And then this year we have the American Rescue Plan Act, or ARPA, which libraries are applying for. So depending on how you're using funds like CARES and ARPA, you may have to comply with CIPA. Okay, so let's talk about just a few scenarios where you're going to have to comply with CIPA. We're not going to get into the really nitty-gritty details of scenarios. And I also want to point out that at the end of the presentation, there's a resources section where I've linked to some ALA documents that talk more about various scenarios when it comes to CIPA compliance. And if you have questions about a particular setup for your library, I would be glad to have that discussion with you directly. So for funding through the FCC, if you're getting E-rate funding, you have to comply with CIPA, and we'll talk about the elements of compliance really soon. You have to comply with CIPA if you're getting any funding for internet access under what we call E-rate Category 1, or anything under E-rate Category 2, which could involve internal networking equipment, maintenance on that equipment, or certain managed services such as managed Wi-Fi. The only time you can get E-rate funding but not comply with CIPA is if you're applying only for telecommunications service. So in that instance, you might have a multi-branch library system where there are transport circuits for data transmission between library branches, and then the internet access is billed separately. We have one library, Lexington Public, that currently applies for E-rate only for that data transmission, and therefore they don't have to comply with CIPA. But as far as I'm aware, every other library applying has to comply with CIPA. They've implemented filtering in order to receive and hold on to that funding. For the Emergency Connectivity Fund, it's somewhat similar, but there's sort of a wrinkle with it that to me doesn't really make sense given how we've handled CIPA in the past, but okay. So for the Emergency Connectivity Fund, if you're applying for discounts on internet access, which might include hotspot service for patron lending programs or laptops and tablets, then you have to be compliant with CIPA. So the exemption is if you're purchasing only hotspot hardware without the internet service, or you're getting laptops or tablets, but you're not getting funding for internet access either from E-rate or the Emergency Connectivity Fund, then you've got an exemption. You don't have to be CIPA compliant. And yes, that's kind of confusing. So if your library has applied for the Emergency Connectivity Fund and you're not sure about CIPA compliance, feel free to talk to me so we can figure out what your library needs to do. All right, then when we talk about funding that goes through IMLS, again, that involves LSTA funding, CARES Act funding, and ARPA funding. You have to be CIPA compliant if you're getting funds for internet access, including hotspot service, or if you're getting computers of any kind, desktops, laptops, tablets. And so that's consistent across all of those programs. And there is an exemption, of course, if you're only getting the hotspot hardware, but without a cellular data plan. So there are three major steps to become CIPA compliant. The first is implementing a technology protection measure, or TPM. That's a fancy way of saying you're filtering. You've installed some filtering software. Maybe you have a firewall appliance that the software runs through, but in some way you are filtering for what is required by CIPA, which we'll address in a minute. You also have to have an internet safety policy. And to be fully compliant with CIPA for E-rate purposes, that policy has to have 5 required elements that address children's safe use of the internet at the library, and we'll address those more later. Also, when you first put that policy into effect, you have to give public notice and hold a hearing where the public can comment on the proposed policy. You only have to do that once. When you first implement the policy, you don't necessarily have to have a hearing every time you make an edit to your internet safety policy. And don't worry, we're going to learn more about that too. So what do you have to filter for in order to be CIPA compliant? So the filter, the technology protection measure, must block internet or must block or filter visual images that are considered obscene, child pornography, or that are harmful to minors. And we'll discuss those legal requirements a little bit more. I'll go ahead and mention that in this context, from a legal standpoint, harmful to minors refers to sexual materials. It's not just anything that you think might be bad for a kid. I also want to point out that this is only about visual images. It does not apply to audio or text. So it's just about blocking the visual images. So those legal definitions, if you access the PDF copy of the slides within Blackboard, there are links to view these definitions. I will warn you though, that especially the definition for harmful to minors, it's more specific than you might imagine. So just be aware when you're following the links. So we do have legal definitions for these terms. This is not just something vague that you sort of decide. There are particular standards that we have to keep in mind. So obscenity, it refers to an image that meets the 3 prongs of the Miller obscenity test. And the Miller test was created by a case that went to the Supreme Court, Miller versus California. That was back in 1973. So for the Miller test, you're trying to determine whether an average person applying contemporary community standards, basically your local community standards, and they find that an image appeals to the prurient interest in sex or bodily excretions, is patently offensive, and has no literary, scientific, artistic, or political value whatsoever. Now, sometimes when we're talking about pornography, rather than obscenity specifically, people think back to a case from 1964, Jacob Ellis versus Ohio, where a Supreme Court justice said that, for pornography, I know it when I see it. That we think we all know what we're talking about when it comes to pornography, but that particular statement or concept was superseded by Miller versus California in 1973. And then for child pornography, I believe we're all aware of this. This would be any visual depiction of sexual activity or sexual contact involving a minor, even if it's computer generated. Clearly, that's illegal. And then harmful to minors, again, refers to users under the age of 17 and involves sexual material. So when you hear the phrase harmful to minors, you might think, oh, maybe this is about violence or bad words or drug use. From a legal standpoint, that's not what harmful to minors means. Basically, it's sexual materials. So I do like to point out that even if you're not specifically filtering for CIPA compliance, even if you're not even thinking about CIPA, there are things that are just not legal. You don't have a right to view at the public library, because a lot of folks will say, well, it's my First Amendment right, but there are limits on what the First Amendment actually covers. So for example, it's still illegal to access child pornography. No one has a First Amendment right to view that material. Obscenity also is not protected by the First Amendment. So what you might think of as pornography in general, not something you can view at the library. And then for harmful to minors, those materials are not constitutionally protected for patrons or users under the age of 17, but those materials would be protected for adults. Now, to me, it's kind of difficult to really parse the difference between obscenity and something that pertains to sexual material, but isn't harmful, but is okay for adults to view, but not minors. That's sort of where CIPA becomes really difficult for me. We're trying to hold these concepts together of, we need to protect kids from all this bad content, but we need to make sure that adults still have access to constitutionally protected materials, and these two goals or ideas are not working in harmony. They're sort of directly in conflict. So a lot of times I feel like we're trying to balance two concepts in our mind that just don't particularly make sense. Now, for these legal definitions, they're very narrow. And when you're trying to comply with CIPA, you're typically using a filtering tool, some kind of software that isn't made with CIPA in mind. So you're having to use broader concepts or broader options within a filtering product, even though the CIPA requirements are very narrow. So it's important to know that if you implement a filter, there's no perfect filter out there, and almost certainly it's going to block content that doesn't have to be filtered for CIPA. So you'll have to work carefully on making sure that the settings are as light as possible while actually blocking what needs to be blocked. Anytime a library has implemented a new filter, it's usually several weeks of, oh, we've got to whitelist this site, we need to change this setting. You've got to be careful about that because we're not the main market for filters. So I just want to clear up a few common misconceptions about CIPA, because you hear filtering, but a lot of folks are thinking about the things that businesses or schools might block access to, but that don't actually have anything to do with CIPA. So for CIPA, you don't have to monitor or track what individual patrons are doing. You're not, saving logs of their sessions, keeping a list of all the sites that they accessed. And you're not going to be able to certify, and no other agency is going to be able to certify the effectiveness of a particular piece of filtering software. So if you're hoping that some of these federal program authorities like the FCC or the Institute of Museum and Library Services are going to have a handy list of, here are the filtering products that are going to meet the requirements, they will decline to do that. They really can't evaluate that. You're just doing your best to implement something that, to your knowledge, is meeting the qualifications. So that's frustrating because we want to be, certain and confident about our compliance, but you're really just being asked to do the very best you can. Also, you don't have a particular set of specified procedures to unblock or lift the filter when patrons request that. That is, again, something that will be a local decision. And we'll talk more about disabling the filter shortly. And also, you don't have to filter for categories other than child pornography, obscenity, or material harmful to minors. Now, certainly, a library could decide on its own to also filter for other things, but the more that you decide to filter, the more likely it is you'll run afoul of First Amendment rights when it comes to CIPA compliance. Also, this is an important one for schools. CIPA does not require you to block any social media sites like YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, TikTok. I just realized I didn't update that list from the last time I gave this presentation. Otherwise, I would have put TikTok on here. I guess that's aged a little bit since 2017. So one common question is, which computers really have to be filtered for CIPA compliance? So if you are receiving federal funds for any purposes that would entail CIPA compliance, where it triggers that requirement, you have to filter all library-owned computers with internet access. At this point, I'm pretty sure that all library-owned computers do have internet access, but if you have them sitting around that for whatever reason never got on the internet, I guess you don't have to filter those because that wouldn't make any sense. But basically, all the library computers need to be filtered. This includes the staff computers that aren't accessible or visible to minors. And keep in mind that it's possible that you might have staff or volunteers who are under the age of 17. So you may have to make sure that that filter stays enabled if they're accessing that particular computer. Also, if you have computers that aren't on the internal wired network, you may need to filter the library's Wi-Fi. It's not strictly required to filter Wi-Fi access, but it's something that logically you might need to do if you've got laptops that you circulate in-house. Or the other option would be to leave the Wi-Fi unfiltered, but you install a particular filtering software directly on those laptops. Very, very important to point out, CIPA does not pertain and does not care about patron-owned computers. So if a patron comes in with their own laptop or tablet and gets on the Wi-Fi, which maybe isn't filtered in your case, that's fine. We don't care about the patron-owned devices. We don't care about a patron using their own device for a hotspot that was loaned by the library. That doesn't matter. All we care about is library-owned computers. And if you've got any questions, please feel free to type into the chat. I do tend to get on a roll and just keep on talking. So, feel free to chime in if any concepts aren't clear, if you have any questions, or if you just have comments. I don't mind seeing a chat going on the side, while I'm presenting. Okay, so we've got a question from Gallatin County. All traffic is filtered, so anything using our Wi-Fi/data ports is filtered. What about if a patron is allowed to borrow a laptop? Are we required to filter content access if they use our hardware on their personally owned internet access? And what about hotspot traffic? These are excellent questions. So if a patron is borrowing a laptop and it's going to be, say, used at home with their own personal internet access, because that's a library-owned computer, it does need to have filtering enabled. So you might have software installed directly on that laptop, or sometimes, depending on the firewall that you use, a firewall may have endpoint protection so that each time the laptop is back on the library's network, it downloads updated definitions and rules for what to be filtered. So there are different ways to handle that. Then in the case of hotspot traffic, it just depends on whether the device being used with the hotspot is patron-owned or library-owned. So for example, let's say that your library applied for the Emergency Connectivity Fund to loan some hotspots for patrons to use at home. Now, if you're just loaning the hotspot to the patron, and you're not, say, loaning a laptop or tablet with it, then the hotspot itself doesn't have to be filtered because the patron's taking it home and using their own devices with that internet access. You might consider filtering the hotspot if you're also loaning it with a laptop, but again, it's all about the computer. So it could be, if you're loaning that kit together of hotspot plus laptop, maybe the cellular carrier is handling the CIPA filtering for you. So it's filtered through the hotspot, and therefore when the laptop gets on the internet, it's filtered. That's one way to be compliant. Or the hotspot could be unfiltered and you have software directly on the laptop. Now, let's see, any other scenarios with hotspot traffic? Sorry, there are so many scenarios that have come up. I hope I addressed everything. But basically, what matters is which type of device is connecting to the internet, and is the internet purchased by the library. Oh, the thing I wanted to mention is that even if, say, you got emergency connectivity funding for a hotspot lending program, and you're not filtering the hotspot itself, because just the patrons are going to use that with their own devices, your library, because it's receiving discounts for cellular internet service, mobile broadband, your library does have to be CIPA compliant. So that means even though you're just getting funds for a hotspot, it's just going to be used at the patron's home. Since you're getting internet funding, you still have to filter the computers that are owned by the library. So all the computers on the network in the building still have to be filtered. Okay, interesting comment from Gallatin County. Well, I'm happy to not need to worry about hotspot filtering in GCPL scenario. The distinction seems arbitrary. Either way, we'd be enabling potential access to obscene material, whether they use our computers or not. So that's an excellent point. You can, if your library is concerned about that, even though technically you wouldn't be required to filter a hotspot loaned by itself, you can choose to filter it anyway. Your library has the local decision on how it complies, and your library is making the certifications that it complies. So if it would be more comfortable to you guys to filter the hotspots regardless of whether or not it's a patron device accessing it or a library-owned device accessing it, that's totally fine. When I talk about these scenarios, I'm referring to information that the American Library Association has provided. And the American Library Association really hates the Children's Internet Protection Act, and they are always looking at scenarios for complying in the least obtrusive way possible. So they always want to minimize the impact of filtering or whether or not you have to filter. So, again, that's more of a local decision. So you can do more than what is technically required. So a question from Ohio County. So checking out a laptop that was purchased with emergency connectivity funds and used on the patron's home internet access has to be filtered. Yes, because that's a library-owned computer. It does need to be filtered. So you would want to have some kind of filtering software installed on it. Excellent question. Okay, we'll keep the questions coming, keep the discussion going, and we will carry on. So another question from Ohio County, what are the recommended filtering software options? So there is not any particular software or setup that has been okayed by the Federal Communications Commission or the Institute of Museum and Library Services to say, like, if you're using this particular product, then you're CIPA compliant. They leave that up to a local decision, and I think they don't want to be the arbiters of whether technology meets that particular standard, especially since it changes so much. So I can't endorse any particular product, but I think this would be a good question for the Kentucky Tech listserv, or you can ask a director to post on the director's listserv to see what other libraries are doing. Probably have a list somewhere of what libraries are using, which wouldn't be an endorsement. So let me just make a quick note about that. And we have a comment from Julianne. DNS filter is pretty easy to use and set up. So thanks for the recommendation. You guys can make recommendations and endorsements in the chat. That's totally fine. So if you just want to share what your library's doing, if you know, please feel free to type that into the chat. So just a few notes on how the filter can be implemented. So there are various setups that can work, and it really depends, I think, on the technical expertise of your library staff and potentially the number of computers that need to be CIPA compliant. So you can have a filtering solution on the server level. So that means all the libraries on the library computers on the local area network, or sometimes a wide area network, would be filtered. So you might have a physical firewall appliance with a content filtering license or subscription, and that affects any computer that's getting internet access that goes through that particular firewall. Thank you, Julianne, for sharing the link. You could also potentially install software on each individual computer that needs to be filtered. Sometimes that's an easier option for libraries that have a low number of computers. It might be a little bit easier for library to manage rather than dealing with a firewall. Again, that's all up to local decision. And when we're talking about especially mobile broadband, maybe the internet service provider is implementing something. So it's fairly common with hotspot lending programs that carriers like T-Mobile or Verizon have some sort of CIPA filtering option that's an additional fee where they handle that for you, and you may have a dashboard where you can interact with that and change some settings. And this is just a note on how content filters work, and this isn't just particular to CIPA. This is just in general how some content may be blocked through these filters. So usually it's a mix of several different methods. So certain websites, URLs are blocked, or certain domains are blocked. So obviously sites with X-rated material sites with pornography. If that's really the purpose of that website, might be that the whole site and any related sites are just blocked. There's also dynamic content filtering that's looking for keywords, phrases, ads, where the links go. So again, it's not specific to visual images, but a lot of times the more sophisticated filtering software you have, the better it is at looking at the content on the page and trying to determine what needs to be blocked. Also for safety or security reasons, you may be blocking certain file types. For example, you might block executable files from being downloaded on library computers, so someone can't attempt to install something that might be malware. And then, of course, there's just basically blocking of viruses and malware. So your filter might be doing several other things in addition to what's required for CIPA filtering. So we've talked about what needs to be filtered, all about those various visual images. But it's really, really, really important for CIPA to understand when the filter needs to be disabled. So back when the American Library Association filed a lawsuit against the Children's Internet Protection Act, it ended up getting all the way to the Supreme Court in 2003. And in the discussion, the Chief Justice, William Rehnquist, basically said that, filtering is not a problem as long as the filter can be disabled upon request. So for patrons age 17 or older, if they want unfiltered access for research purposes, they don't even really need to say what they're going to be doing, but you should be able to, lift that filter, disable it, whitelist the site, so they can access those constitutionally protected materials. And despite objections, there was also a statement along the lines of, patrons, don't have the right not to be embarrassed. So, the argument was, people would feel uncomfortable. Let's say if the filter accidentally blocks something related to human sexuality or sexual reproduction or something along those lines, it doesn't matter that it might be uncomfortable for the patron to ask about that. Nobody's, has a right not to be embarrassed when asking that. So, really, as long as you are going about, applying the filter and disabling it when needed, then CIPA is constitutional, not an issue. Of course, ALAs still disagree with that, but that's what we've got. So it is possible, if you don't implement CIPA correctly, that you can open your library up to an as-applied legal challenge. So for example, if you guys implemented filtering, but you refuse to ever provide unfiltered internet access to patrons, and you're deliberately not giving them access to constitutionally protected materials, say by deliberately filtering things that aren't required, such as human sexuality and sexual reproduction, you're opening yourself up to a legal challenge because you are preventing patrons from accessing constitutionally protected materials. So that's fun. It's nice to know that despite your best efforts, there's always a way to mess this up and then you can be sued. Now, it's not common, but not unheard of. There was a school district in Missouri that was sued for blocking materials related to LGBTQ issues. And so since they failed to address that, they were sued, and I think they had to pay some funds to the plaintiff. And then they also, I think, had to agree to certain monitoring to ensure that they were properly implementing CIPA for a certain number of years. And I think there's at least one library district out in Washington State that was sued. So in that particular lawsuit didn't result in damages against the library, but it was a lengthy, expensive process to defend the library against those charges. So in general, if there's something you can do to keep the library from being sued, I would encourage that, even though I'm not a lawyer and I can't provide legal advice. So best practices. So again, the American Library Association hates filtering. wishes we didn't have to do it. Frankly, I'm not a fan either. I think CIPA is a well-intentioned but flawed law that was created by people who have this fantasy idea of how easy it is to take all that internet, both good and bad, and put it through a filter, and then we'll just come out with the good internet at the end so children are safe. That's a fine idea. I think a lot of people agree with keeping children safe, but in reality, technology is so flawed that it's not really possible. And we're putting schools and libraries through something pretty expensive to try to make this fantasy happen. But let's say we're going to have to do this anyway. We really need our funding. How can we do this in the best possible way that's going to create the least problems? So first and foremost, make sure that you're filtering the minimum amount required by law. So you don't have to go out of your way to try to filter for stuff that's not required. We talked before about that harmful to minors concept, which in this case refers to sexual materials. So, you might run afoul of the law if you're trying to block things that you might consider personally offensive, but are not really specified by the law. So again, those references to hate speech and drug use and violent images, that's not really what CIPA is about. It's really all about those sexual materials. And you also want to try to select a filtering software option that gives you a lot of flexibility in the options. So you want something that's going to be easy to disable the filter. So, as is often the case, the nicer solutions that are easiest to use and give you the best options tend to be more expensive. But there are some lower cost options out there. We already had, a good suggestion in the chat. So just take a look at the options, make sure you're choosing the options that are least onerous to your staff and patrons, and make sure that your staff know how to disable the filter or the process to get the filter lifted if needed when working with patrons. And as we're doing right now, you want to make sure that library staff are educated on the requirements of CIPA and that they know that sites are going to have to be unblocked or the filter will have to be lifted when patrons age 17 or older ask for it. So I've found when I've done this presentation in the past that a lot of times, the person who handles the E-rate filing or the library system administrator, IT manager is aware of filtering, but a lot of times that information hasn't really funneled down to the frontline staff who are helping patrons using public access computers or helping a patron that has an issue getting on the Wi-Fi. So it's important that, since 90% of Kentucky public libraries filter their internet, and it actually may be a little bit higher, most Kentucky libraries filter for CIPA compliance. So most library staff should have at least some level of familiarity. So obviously you're getting the benefit of Katie Lay's wisdom through me today, and that's great. But if you've got other staff members who you think should be aware, certainly direct them to Katie Lay's online learning platform so they can watch the archived recording of this, or tell them to give me a call, because we want to make sure that people are comfortable and understand what's really on the line, especially when you're going to be talking to patrons who might not like or understand why the library is filtering. And also, you want to be proactive in making sure that patrons are aware that your library filters and that they can ask for sites to be unblocked or for the filter to be lifted. So that might be on a splash screen when you first get on the computer, or when you're getting on the Wi-Fi, letting people know that filtering is in effect, and here's how you ask for the filter to be lifted. Or you might have some signage in the public access computing area. And preferably, you'll have that specific information in your internet safety policy. Let's see. So a question from Julie Ann, what is the best way to advertise to patrons that we filter? Is a simple click-through statement when they log in on a device enough? So Julianne, I would think that would be, oh, I'm sorry, that was from Jean. I think that would be sufficient. It's again up to a local decision, but I think a combination of having the statement that they check or an agreement that they sign, and then also having signage posted might be good, because we know that a lot of people will just say yes to anything you put on that splash screen. They're not going to read it. So it might be good to have, additional signage within the computing area, just so maybe they'll be more aware of that option. Let's see.
Above Julianne's comment, Sean had a question.
Okay. Oh, I see. Yes. Thank you, Alicia, for pointing that out. So, question from Gallatin County. Do other patrons have a right to avoid accidentally viewing that? And if so, how far are we obligated to go to enable someone to view it if they request it? Oh boy, that you're really getting into the tricky questions here, Sean. I'm so glad you're here. I really am. So, yeah, I think, in the law, it doesn't really specify, how far you have to go to, make sure that it's only the patron who's requesting unfiltered access is the only one viewing it. I mean, you can take practical steps like, physical dividers between computer stations, or having some kind of protective screen that keeps the screen from being visible from certain angles. Possibly loaning laptops within the library so people can spread out would be great. One thing you do need to be aware of, or a couple things, would be, there are scenarios where, a patron will have asked for unfiltered internet access, and again, they might be accessing things that aren't constitutionally protected at all, or for child patrons. So if you have someone who's looking at something they shouldn't be looking at in an area where children can be viewing it, it may be advisable to contact the police. I mean, clearly you are required to contact the police if someone's trying to view child pornography. But if they're in the presence of children, potentially exhibiting something that would be considered obscenity, exhibiting obscenity is illegal in the state of Kentucky. So despite what we're talking about with CIPA, there are multiple ways that viewing obscenity in the library is just not legal. So there may be situations where you would contact the police. For other patrons, if they happen to view it and they're not happy, maybe just rearrange where folks are sitting. Maybe tap the patron on the shoulder if they are looking at something that isn't okay to view based on state law or CIPA. Because even if you lift the filter, it doesn't mean that, okay, the patron has a free-for-all. They can look at anything they want to. All the other laws still apply. Obviously, you can't view obscenity. That's not constitutionally protected. Child pornography, we know that's illegal. Just, exhibiting obscenity in Kentucky, that's illegal. So you've got steps. You can potentially ask a patron to leave if they're not abiding by the rules, even if they technically asked for the filter to be disabled. I hope I kind of addressed that question. I know we've got some other questions here from Julie Ann. What is okay, I think we addressed the advertising about the policy. Let's see. Let me skip on down. I apologize if I've missed anything. Okay. Let's see, another question from Gallatin County. Sometimes the library lets patrons use a laptop in a private room for meetings or whatnot, but if the intent is likely to view pornography for recreational purposes, on what grounds could we deny that, if any? Well, I think in that particular scenario, you can't just determine in advance, well, this person seems sketchy, they're probably viewing porn, we're not going to allow that. But if you do, discover that someone is viewing that, I mean, that's illegal. You can ask them to leave the library. You may have within your patron behavior or internet use policy provisions about, depending on the severity of what has been done or how many times somebody's violated a policy, you can temporarily just suspend library their privileges for the internet access. Now, that's a whole other kettle of fish. We can't permanently ban patrons. That's basically not legal. But you can, in the most narrow way possible, suspend certain privileges if they're not following the policies of the library. So, if you've got a repeat offender who's been told that their, library internet access has been suspended due to violations, you certainly don't have to provide the laptop in that case. Okay, so then we've got another scenario. I've had enough encounters with provocateurs at my university who were probably trying to get the material needed to file a lawsuit. That I'm worried about how to approach edge cases like that. Okay, that's again probably another nice big kettle of fish. Loving the questions, Sean. It's all good. So, again, you have to go back to library policy, creating a policy that complies with CIPA, but in the minimum way possible, clearly outlining how your library handles filtering, how sites can be unblocked, how people may be suspended for violations, or how potentially to resolve disputes if someone disagrees. So it might be some sort of grievance policy where they can contact the director, and then that could be appealed to the library board. But that's just tricky. I mean, to be perfectly honest, I think CIPA does put people in the scenario where you're supposed to filter for certain things, but also make constitutionally protected materials accessible. And then also, from a legal standpoint, technically only a court can determine that something is obscene, which is just another wrinkle. So you've got a lot of weird things to try to kind of balance. I think for the most part in Kentucky libraries, filtering hasn't been controversial, and the folks who are really protesting against it or have complaints are people who were clearly trying to view obscenity, and they just need to be referred to the library policy and or Kentucky state law, and that should resolve it. As far as more persistent provocateurs, I'm not frankly entirely sure. That might be a good discussion to have on the listserv. Let's see. Okay, so I think we've addressed some best practices, and this is probably going to run over a little bit since we had some good discussion and we got started a little bit late. So just keep in mind that filters are not perfect. It's going to block things that shouldn't be blocked, and kids are smart. They're going to find, well, people in general are going to find ways around content that should be filtered. So, just make the best decisions you can about how you implement. You don't need to apologize, Sean. I really enjoy the questions. The challenge is, again, I'm not a lawyer, and I have ideas about how things could be handled. But frankly, when we're talking to, real world scenarios, what I've got is theory. I don't have, direct practice with, dealing with these provocative patrons who are trying deliberately to stir up trouble. So that's when I become nervous about answering some of those questions. For some of you, besides the intellectual freedom concerns that we have about filtering, there are some folks in the library community who have raised certain security concerns about the way filters operate and can potentially, expose content that, shouldn't be trackable or viewable. So if you're more interested in that topic, there are slides from an ALA presentation from several years ago called The Man in the Middle that may be of interest to you. And then if you have questions about particular, filters or some of the legal, arguments about this, you might check out WebJunction, ALA, and SpiceWorks. Okay. So we need to address the internet safety policy. We've got to get through this. So if you need to leave at 11, go ahead and do so. But I'm going to make sure this content is covered for the recording. So going back to that internet safety policy that you need to have, there are 5 required elements, which basically involve the library saying it's the parent's responsibility or the guardian's responsibility to make sure that children aren't getting in trouble and are using the internet safely. You don't want to make it the personal responsibility of library staff or the library itself to act in loco parentis and make decisions about what the child should be doing. You basically, in your policy, need to make sure it's clear that the library is taking some steps. But at the end of the day, we can't make any guarantees, and it's really up to the parent to make sure that the child is safe. They're not accessing things that are inappropriate, they're being safe when using direct messaging. They're not breaking the law, doing stuff like hacking. That they're not sharing personally identifiable information, and that's not being leaked, and just generally restricting their access to, materials that are harmful to minors. So it's great in the policy if you, also address, how you're filtering in the policy for getting the filter disabled. That's just kind of a bonus, but you do need to have those 5 requirements in order to be fully eligible with your policy. So remember, in the policy, you want to, try to stick as closely as possible to, the language of the statute to avoid First Amendment legal challenges. So, for example, it's better to refer to obscenity or something that is obscene rather than the general term pornography, because that doesn't have the same legal definition, or a word like offensive, explicit. That's again, doesn't have the same kind of legal definition. So we're talking about obscenity, child pornography, material harmful to minors. Feel free to direct people to those definitions or refer to the particular laws. And as always, with any library policy, talk to your lawyer before you implement or revise your policy and adopt that. And if your library doesn't have a lawyer, doesn't have an attorney, maybe find an example from a library that does have an attorney. Try to copy from someone who has been able to really go through those steps. That might keep you on the straight and narrow. All right, for internet policies, KDLA does have one on its website. There's actually 3 different samples in one document. It's getting a little aged. It's on my to-do list to revise that particular policy. But I do have some other examples from Kentucky libraries, and then a version for CIPA compliance that I've tweaked that I can send you directly. So feel free to contact me if you have questions. There are also some examples from E-Rate Central. They're an E-Rate consulting group. So it's information for both schools and libraries. And I don't like to spotlight a Kentucky library to say, well, you should just be like such and such county library. So instead, I'll refer you guys to Nashville Public Library. I think they've got a pretty good policy, especially talks about why they're filtering and legal requirements. So that might give you some ideas. Thanks everyone for attending. I apologize that we're running over, but you will have access to the recording. So have a good day if you're leaving right now. Let's see. Now for the public hearing, you need to provide reasonable notice that you're having this hearing so that the public can attend and address what's in your policy. And so since we're in Kentucky, the meeting must follow the guidelines of the Kentucky Open Meetings Act. A lot of times libraries will just have their CIPA internet safety policy hearing as part of a regularly scheduled board meeting. For a hearing to be compliant with Kentucky state law, you do need to give notice in a local newspaper, the one of largest circulation in the county. And if it's a special call board meeting, you need to have signage within the building indicating at least 24 hours in advance that you're going to have this hearing. So it's not just that you have the meeting and maybe people randomly hear about it. You do have to proactively go through the steps to make sure notice is given, and you want to keep copies of that information as part of your CIPA compliance documentation. And thank you, Jonathan, for attending. So again, the meeting may be held as part of a regular library board meeting as long as the agenda is advertised and you're giving the public the opportunity to comment. So in addition to just checking a box so that you're saying you're following the law, this is also a good opportunity if you've got community members who are concerned about it to explain why the policy is being adopted. It might be because we need E-rate funding to improve our internet access, or we're going to use the ARPA funds from KDLA to purchase new computers because ours are really old. So here's the reason why we're doing this. And obviously there's a financial benefit to the library and therefore the taxpayers, but also it's an opportunity to explain that this is also in the interest of protecting children who are using the library's internet. And that concept in general has not been controversial in Kentucky. I do have a copy of a meeting notice that a library used when they needed to advertise their meeting. So this is not the perfect template that you must use. This is just an example. You can say something a little bit different, but here's some language just in case you are looking for some. A note for E-rate and the Emergency Connectivity Fund is that there's a sort of wrinkle where you're allowed to apply and get funding, but not have to comply with CIPA in the first year of compliance. So after the CIPA went into effect in April 2001, the first year that your library applied for E-rate or the Emergency Connectivity Fund, got that funding commitment and then filed a Form 486 to certify CIPA compliance. That's your first year of compliance. And on that form, if you're already CIPA compliant, you can just say, yes, I comply with CIPA because I have to. There is an option on the form, though, to say that this is your first year of compliance and you are undertaking actions to become compliant. So you have that whole year to go through the steps. You need to document what you're doing to become compliant. And if you're not sure about when your library last filed for E-rate, feel free to talk to me. Usually you can just look up the basic history of your library's filing online, say on E-rate Central, but there are situations where maybe your library's number that identifies your library with the E-rate program has changed. Now, the second year that you apply for E-rate and or the Emergency Connectivity Fund, you have to be fully compliant at the start of that year. So that's just particularly for E-rate and the Emergency Connectivity Fund. That's not about funding that goes through IMLS. So again, keep documentation of your compliance as far as your policy, the public hearing, how you're filtering. For E-rate purposes, you can find more information on the program administrator's website about the documents that you need to retain and the period of document retention. Or talk to me. And now just to get us wrapped up, got a few more things to close out. I think, we've already had this discussion in the middle of the webinar, which was great. But CIPA is a challenge because we're trying to balance some concepts that don't really go together. So we've kind of addressed intellectual freedom as far as First Amendment rights, and then you've got children's safety and also budgetary concerns. So libraries, especially Kentucky libraries, have greatly benefited from sources of federal funding. We wouldn't have nearly the level of connectivity we have in Kentucky libraries without the E-rate program. A lot of libraries wouldn't have been able to update their computers without some federal funding through IMLS at various times. But in order to get that funding, you're potentially having to compromise the mission of your library, your own personal convictions, sort of the professional ethics as defined by the American Library Association. You're trying to do something that's going to get your library money and maybe will keep patrons safe, but is really causing problems with access. And libraries are all about access to information. So it's definitely a challenge, and there are not perfect answers, if you can't tell based on the way I've responded to some of these. So for this webinar, I hope that nothing else, that you're able now to answer some basic questions. So does your library need to comply with the Children's Internet Protection Act due to E-rate or LSTA or any other federal source of funding? And if your library does have to comply with CIPA, are the library-owned computers actually being filtered? And do you and the other staff members know how to disable the filter for patrons age 17 or older who request access for research purposes? So if you don't have the answers to these questions, definitely investigate more. Talk to your director, your IT staff, talk to me. I'm glad to kind of help you figure out if something needs to be done to make your library fully compliant. And then we've got lots of other resources when it comes to CIPA. There are various guides from the Federal Communications Commission, companies like E-Rate Central that help libraries file for E-rates, obviously in the American Library Association. I really like the summary from the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction. The person who wrote that brief is probably the library expert on CIPA compliance in the country. Very intelligent man, so I really, think he's got some good information to look at. And then also ALA has some various guides when it comes to newer sources of funding, such as the CARES Act. I did want to point out in particular some resources that relate to the Emergency Connectivity Fund, since that's more recent and things have been a little bit different with that. You can look at information from the American Library Association. And then the Federal Communications Commission has some FAQs as well as a flow chart to help you determine whether or not you need to filter. If you want to keep the discussion going, or say ask other libraries what they're doing in regard to CIPA compliance, you might join the Kentucky Tech Listserv if you're not already a member. I post updates on programs like E-Rate and the Emergency Connectivity Fund, but members can also ask questions and get responses from library staff around the state. So feel free to contact me if you want to join. So last but not least, I want to thank you guys very much for watching, especially when we had some technical issues this morning. If you don't mind, I really appreciate it if you complete a survey for us. That's really helpful with our federal funding and also to determine ways that we can improve what we're offering. And we need to thank the Institute of Museum and Library Services. IMLS funding through the Grants to States program supports KDLA's continuing education opportunities, including technology-related webinars presented by me, and we couldn't do this without IMLS. So I'm going to hang out for a few more minutes. So if you have questions, you can go ahead and ask them. Otherwise, you're free to contact me at lauren.abner@ky.gov, or you can call me at 502-564-1728.
You do have a question there from Julianne in the chat.
Julie, okay. Oh yeah, we've stopped the recording. Wait, are we still recording?
Yeah, you're still recording.
Oh, okay. I don't know why my share went away. In any case, all right, we might do a little bit of editing at the end. So for Julian's question, do all staff need the ability to unblock content? Not necessarily. Your library needs to have a procedure in place for how the filter gets lifted or sites get unblocked. So hopefully, in the interest of cross-training, and especially giving staffing situations right now with COVID, multiple staff members should hopefully know how to do that and have the administrative ability to do that. But it doesn't necessarily mean that every single staff member has to know how to do that. It just might end up happening if you happen to have a small staff anyway, because I know for a lot of libraries, everybody, including the director, ends up working on the public service desk, handling requests in the computing area. So you might end up teaching everyone just for that situation. Whew. Okay, feel free to type in any other questions. Thank you so much. I don't know if poor Sean is still on. I didn't mean to make Sean feel like his questions, oh, you're still on here. So Sean, your questions were wonderful. This is sometimes I'm like, oh, this is a really good question, but it's so hard to answer. That's the part I hate, is not being able to, give good responses. Oh, I guess I'll go ahead and stop the recording.